most of my focus is on the wildlife side of things. I do a lot of controlled studies in wildlife and field studies, basically trying to collect data for you modelers and trying to find out what you guys want. And so now I have the duty of doing the livestock perspective. This is the way my brain works. I completely simplified this. I'm going to just basically use kind of a case example with bovine tuberculosis. I'm going to be pretty superficial about it too, and I'm not going to, it's a global issue, and each country and each region have their kind of own unique, there's a lot of overlap, but they also have a lot of their own unique situation, depending on their culture and geography. So there's a lot of experts actually in the field in bovine TB here and have experienced that in their own countries or own states. And so please feel free to pipe in and add, because I'm basically actually working mostly from publications that are actually slightly outdated too. So anyway, here we go. Well, I think one of the most important things about the livestock perspective is that you are dealing with people. I mean, with everything you're dealing with people. In fact, most of our problems are people related in what we try to do here. But really, you're dealing with farmers and ranchers trying to make a buck, trying to stay alive and comfortable. And so that's kind of the main thing when you're dealing with livestock and in disease situations. With livestock, you get regulators who want to regulate diseases and regulate how livestock are managed in their either states or on a federal level. And then what's very important, that all this is intertwined with the local and regional, state, national economies, even international economies, actually, because a lot of these diseases cause trade issues and trade restrictions and things like that. And those are very important in the realm of what decisions are made. Politics and economics rule. And basically, this springs off of that. If you're dealing with just a disease in the livestock industry, that's basically confined to the farm and the state and federal agricultural and livestock agencies, and a lot of what is done in those management is management tools developed by very targeted research. When you end up with a wildlife-livestock interface, that becomes a lot more complicated, and then you get a whole lot of agencies and stakeholders who have their agendas and want certain things to happen. And sometimes that's good because you get people working together from different perspectives. Often because we're all humans, that doesn't work so well, and there's a lot of antagonism there. Usually it's a mix of both, of course, because people are people, and egos always kind of interplay there. So there's a toolbox for management strategies on the livestock side of things, and usually they're all very, whatever the case, whatever the disease is, there's definitely a very kind of uniform approach to things initially. And so a big tool we use is if there's a disease outbreak, you depopulate. Say like in the case of foot and mouth or TB, you depopulate your herd, you decontaminate. Other methods are test and remove policies, and that was actually a really huge or a tool used basically over the last century for many diseases like TB and brucellosis. We get a lot of movement restriction and zoning, things like that. Vaccination, if there's a vaccine, that is often used in response to a disease outbreak, and then it's good to be able to trace back or trace forward to find where the source is and where it's gone to since then. Now on a preventative level, we also have vaccination again for where it's pertinent. We have pre-movement testing, surveillance, monitoring to see where if the disease is there, if it's not there previously. Some operations, such as swine or poultry, often have very closed systems, at least in this country, and tight biosecurity. That varies worldwide, of course. And then this is a little nebulous, but exclusion and avoidance of source exposure. And that actually plays a really huge role when you have a wildlife interface, if you know how to do that. So I'm going to go with bovine TB as a kind of a case study. And right here in our very own Michigan, which Dan O'Brien here is intimately involved with. Since the turn of the last century, TB was a really big problem, especially at the turn of the century, 1900s. Mycobacterium bovis there was a high percentage in the cattle herds. Humans were quite often affected by that. This was before pasteurization of milk, and so that was a pretty serious zoonotic problem as well. And our country and several European countries started eradication programs for bovine tuberculosis. They used this test and slaughter method, where you test any reactor animal that is removed from the system. They improved their tracking, and they did a lot of meat inspection, and that's been going on pretty much almost 100 years, I'd say. So in Michigan specifically, their last TB-infected herd was depopulated in 1974. And 5 years later, they acquired accredited free status from TB, and that's a big deal. It's a big economic deal for folks in a state. Unfortunately, and they didn't know how serious it was at the time, but in 1975, a hunter-killed white-tailed deer was discovered to have TB, but pretty much it was thought that was an anomaly, and it wasn't really looked at very intensely. But in 1994, another infected deer was found by hunters, and so that initiated a bit more some surveillance activities. A lot more concerned, or people were a lot more concerned about that, and so they started looking at wildlife and looking at cattle as well, and captive cervids. And they found that the prevalence of TB in white-tailed deer was nearly 5% when they looked at it then. And then, unfortunately, then in 1998 was when cattle herds started breaking down again in Michigan, and they eventually lost their TB-free status. And this kind of shows that initially, and rightly so, I mean, TB was a huge problem in livestock and in people, and so that program was started with a very kind of a narrow view on regulating livestock, because wildlife really weren't very much considered, but this kind of backfires in many situations, because if you look at things in a narrow way that way, and that's just based on experience. I mean, this is all 2020 hindsight, right? It turns out that there was a wildlife component to this for quite a few decades, actually, is what's thought. They just didn't know it. And that spillover from cattle to deer is probably happened in the 50s? Is that what they think? Yeah. Yeah, okay. And so livestock management tools were implemented. In fact, 10 of the 11 I mentioned were implemented. Again, we don't have a vaccine that we use in cattle, so that's not an option at this point. We're always working on that, but that is not something that we use right now. There was a big component of management of wildlife that I won't totally get into, but they did increase hunting, and there was a feed ban, because a lot of deer are supplementally fed in the northern United States to attract them in. Money spent on this between 94 and 2010, just by Michigan alone. This isn't looking at on a federal scale and how much is spent by the federal government, but in Michigan alone, $200 million was spent in trying to fight this disease, but it's still kind of trucking along. And so since 1998, and this is up to 2012, so I don't have all the outbreaks documented here, but 53 TB outbreaks occurred in cattle herds. And 7 of those were actually herds that got either depopulated or put under quarantine, got reinfected. So it's an ongoing problem, despite the incredible effort that's been done by the state and the federal government. So with Michigan, wildlife is a very important component. White-tailed deer are thought to be the source of infection of most of these herd breakdowns. And studies have shown that the prevalence odds of TB in wild white-tailed deer as a source of infection that's highly correlated with the incidence rate of TB in cattle herds. And it's been shown in controlled studies that indirect exposure of cattle to TB through deer can occur. Say if a deer feeds on a feed source that is also later used by cattle, that transmission can occur. So I didn't put a map up, actually. I should have. With TB in Michigan, there's a very distinct zone that is used as a basically increased surveillance that happens there, restrictions of movements, increased testing, and that sort of decreases as you move out from that core area of endemic disease in white-tailed deer. And basically in that area, in that zone, the herd level risk factors have been shown to be associated with livestock feeds, or the way, say, farms store their feed, and whether there's wildlife access to that feed, or hay, or whatever silage. There's thought to be a link to standing water sources. And in that endemic area, herd breakdowns in livestock aren't really thought, or cattle movement doesn't play as large a role, and it's mostly attributed to wildlife exposure on those farms. But I just had this conversation with Dan O'Brien. As you go out away from that endemic area, cattle movement does become has a bigger play in whether and herds getting infected, and so movement of cattle is a risk factor, as well as proximity to TB-infected herds, and so there's a difference even regionally in Michigan what sources are, but there's still actually a lot of questions as far as that goes, the transmission routes and things like that. So I'll move on to differences, say, in Great Britain and Ireland, where they have TB in their cattle herds and also a reservoir in Eurasian badgers. And looking through the literature, there's a really nice review by Skuse et al. Done in 2012 that shows also that cattle movements and contiguous premises where TB is present in herd size plays a really big role in, and they are very important herd level risk factors, even though there is a very important wildlife component in these two places. And then lower on the list, but not, I wouldn't say less important, they're badger densities and cattle feeding practices, food storage, just aren't as heavily weighed. But they are still a factor. And then I'll go to Spain, where Christian works intimately with a wild boar and deer reservoir there. Also, in Martinez Lopez reported as well that actually the production systems and high cattle numbers play a very, very heavy role in TB breakdowns in cattle herds. But then the presence and proximity of fenced hunting estates is also highly, highly important. And there's differences in the way in hunting estates and geography, and I won't go into it in detail, but those are actually very important and also cause us to pose a lot of questions about that. In New Zealand, they have a brush-tailed possum as a reservoir. Again, though, the risk factors weighs heavily again on the farm, but then lower down the list, you still have proximity to wildlife reservoir hosts and their habitats, and so there's just different nuances in different geographies. In Africa, it's going to be hugely different again, and you have way more of a human component in the whole system, and different types of land uses, and so those questions are those types of data are very important on a regional level. And so when you think of one disease and and we got cattle, we got TB, we have a wildlife reservoir, each area is going to be hugely different, and the questions you're going to ask or the data you're going to collect are going to be very different from place to place. So as I said, there's a lot of overlap in risk factors in the many regions, but there's a whole lot of differences too, and just to keep that in mind. That'll strongly influence the risk factors you may detect. And then also that when we look at on a livestock scale and on a farming scale, that management approaches are going to be very different in different places as well, and those are dependent on either the logistics on the farm or farmer compliance. There's a lot of social, cultural, and economic factors involved in how they will manage their farms and how amenable they will be to changes in how they manage and making changes to manage a disease situation. And they got to make money. I mean, that's kind of also the bottom line for them. So if somebody recommends a change, a mitigation, if they're going to lose money off that, there's no way they're going to do it. I mean, that's not realistic. So I guess, this is kind of general too. Gaps we would need to address in NIMBioS specifically is we don't know a lot of how it survives on substrates and what role that plays in transmission of disease to cattle. Does it survive on the landscape for a long time, and is that maybe why some herds will break down or break down again? There's been a bit of work lately on landscaping and geography and habitat on farms, and whether that plays a large role, or I shouldn't say large, but some sort of role in whether herds are in whether herds are likely to have a TB breakdown or not. Matthews put out a paper that's out of the UK that said that nature-friendly landscaping decreased risk in TB breakdowns, which is kind of interesting. And then open hunting estates, which are not as intensely managed as some other hunting areas. You don't have a high density of wildlife. Is a decreased risk factor. One thing very important, and different countries have different methods of tracking cattle and cattle movements, but there's always gaps there, and there's always problems with people not being quite forthcoming maybe about how many cattle they have moved on and off their properties, and what's official may be a bit different from what really happened, and so that's usually it's a real problem for epidemiologists trying to figure out what the heck was going on with that herd and why it has TB again. And so that's a huge gap, and we don't have yet in place a national ID system. Michigan, is it just the endemic zone that has it is statewide now? Okay, so that's great, but that's been a long time in coming to electronically ID cattle here. I know in Ireland they have an amazing system in place where you can track every single animal. And there's huge databases on that, and so it depends on But again, in the African countries with TB, that's probably a really, I don't know how difficult that is to track, but I guess it depends on the how the owner, probably the wealth of the owner, I would guess, is how well they identify their animals.
Pauline, is your sense that is here to stay for a while? That this inability to track cattle is something that's going to be a long-term thing?
Yes.
Probably, yeah.
I think we'll all be retired before.
Yeah.
Seriously.
There's been a lot of resistance to that. There's been a lot of resistance. And I think under duress, that gets instigated maybe or implemented in a state-by-state basis. But
even when you implement it, it's got problems.
It's got problems.
In some cases, the producers are the ones that are given the task of putting the tags on the cattle, and sometimes they don't get on the cattle.
And sometimes the readers don't work that well either.
You need the right drivers to do it. That's
Yeah.
presumably a commercial disease.
Yeah. It's so there are a lot of factors. Yeah.
Yeah, I think tracking in Africa is probably out of the question because of our practice, the way we look after these animals.
Yeah.
It's nobody owns the land. If you have cattle, you take it in the bush or the
Yeah.
cattle post, and you leave your animals there, and you go back to your house, and from time to time, you will then go there, and maybe your animals have multiplied in number, but you'll be able to tell because you know who the mother is or the grandmother.
Right.
Yeah. So they'll be following, that
Right.
one. So these are my animals.
Right.
That is one. And then when you leave them there, they do mingle, with the buffalo and the other animals.
Right.
So it makes it very, very, very difficult actually to control.
Right.
Even bovine TB.
I think, that's a good example, of huge cultural differences where you may even have to treat all the livestock as wildlife too and do radio collar studies in the livestock. I've seen those studies and overlap with wildlife, and they're really cool. And those are data that are difficult to collect, but should be collected if folks are amenable to having their stock radio collared.
And potentially we believe that all the animals within the area are host for reservoirs.
Yeah.
But maybe the bacteria itself has preference. If there is more buffalo, the buffalo, will be infected. And if the buffalo population goes down, you will see that it has gone to another species. But how the bacteria has run these animals, we don't know. So that you can treat the buffalo first and maybe the
Right.
second. That is not known.
Right. And those are, it's not, I shouldn't go into this, but there's, because I'm doing the livestock talk, but there's so many basic science, basic immunological data that we just don't have for any of these species, and that goes for diagnostics as well. And people talk about validation of diagnostics, and it's hard enough in livestock. In wildlife, I don't think you can use the term validation. I don't think it's valid. Validation is not valid in wildlife. Really, you do the best you can, and you test as many animals as you can and try to evaluate it that way. But yeah, let's see. So I got into diagnostics and testing. With TB, the test is not perfect. No test is perfect, but the skin test for TB, at least, which is still the main one used, is not that awesome, and so you miss a lot. You miss a lot of animals, and some animals can test repeatedly negative over years and then come up positive suddenly, and then your whole herd is full of TB, and you don't realize it. And we had one of those in southern Colorado as well. I know Michigan has had a few, and we had one in southern Colorado where it tested negative over the years, and then suddenly we had 30% of the animals had TB, and they were heavily lesioned too on slaughter. And so it's like, well, how did that happen? Well, our testing for TB at least is not ideal, and we've been working on this for over 100 years, and we still can't get a good vaccine or test for TB. We're working on it, but that applies to most interface diseases. Here, I don't know if we're gonna. Let's see. Well, so I think Ryan's going to talk about this a little bit more and emphasize there's, at least in TB, there's a potential. We always talk about, those wildlife have this disease, but that did spill from cattle into wildlife, and in the beginning, and we're all worried about wildlife spilling it back into our livestock. But I think with a lot of these diseases, we still have to look in terms of livestock spilling over disease into our wildlife. Cost-benefit analyses, I don't know if we'll talk about economics at all, but that is that plays a huge factor in livestock industry. If you're looking on the livestock perspective, and we're thinking about all these cool vaccines and diagnostics and doing implementing all these management strategies, but we need to know how much it costs, and we need to have a guess on whether it's going to work and how long it's going to take to work and whether that's going to be worth it. And so that's a really important aspect too. I mean, if you have your disease models, but I think you need to parallel economics models with these in order to have a good program, have a solid program, and be able to argue the utility or the advantage of your program. Because if it's too costly, then you're probably not going to have very good compliance. And then we talked about this too. I mean, social and cultural challenges. I mean, that's all over. You got to keep those in mind because nothing is the same in different places, and those types of social data need to be, and whether a certain tool can be used in that situation or how much you think it might be used is, I think, a big question, and should always be asked when managing these diseases. I guess that's it. I hope this was helpful. I wasn't really sure how to approach this, and this is very narrow in the TB realm, but it can be applied to other diseases. I didn't go into vector diseases. That's a whole other, I mean, you have a whole other component of management with vector arboviruses and things like that. But just to hit home that, they're livestock or farmers and folks. I mean, they're people. It's a livelihood, and you got to work with that and the human component. So anyway, hope it's fodder for discussion.